Today we have a tax law taster session with my colleague Bernard here, who I'll let him do his own introduction. For those that haven't come across me yet, my name's Charlotte Burton. I'm the marketing manager here at CCLS. So you might have had communications from me about different sessions that we've been running, just to give you an opportunity to learn a bit more about coming to study at Queen Mary, and particularly at CCLS, and to meet members of our team. So throughout June, we're running a series of taster lectures, so particularly for you to get an opportunity to see what sessions could be like when you come and study with us in Queen Mary. And this is the first of the taster lectures. So today is on tax law, but we also have various sessions on or various taster lectures on different program subjects as well. So lots available for you to meet different academics as well and ask questions. So the session today, Bernard's going to take us through a taster lecture, which will be, I'm sure, very interesting for you. Please feel free to use the Q&A or the chat function to ask questions. If there's anything related to the content of the taster lecture, I will signal to Bernard and he will have a look through and see if he can answer that as we go along, because we want it to be nice and interactive. But if there's anything else, then we will we'll have a Q&A section at the end, so you're welcome to ask questions there. Bernard is obviously our academic, and I have some knowledge of kind of our student support and admissions information, but we'll try and keep that off of this webinar today, so mainly really focusing on tax law specifically. So if you've got tax law questions, please feel free to ask away, and we will do our best as we can to answer them. Well, I'm sure Bernard is it's his specialist subject, so there'll be lots he'll be able to help with. So Bernard, are you ready for me to kind of hand over to you?
Absolutely, good to go.
Okay, I'll pass over to you to introduce yourself and take the floor.
Sure, thank you very much, Charlotte. So my name is Bernard Schneider. I am the senior lecturer in international tax law. That's the equivalent of associate professor for those of you who are more used to that kind of terminology. I'm the director of the LLM in international tax law, and also the academic director of the Institute of Tax Law, which is, I mean, I won't bore you with the details, but it's basically the part of CCLS that is responsible not just for the LLM program, but also for the PhD and also for research activities, conferences we run, guest lecturers and speakers and this kind of thing. So various teaching, research, and unfortunately admin aspects of life at CCLS, at least on the tax side. You know, as you know, this is billed as a tax taster lecture, which I will give you. You can see there's a 38 slide deck being shared. We're not going to quite get through that in the hour or so that we have, not least because I want to leave some time to talk about, in fact, I would like to start by telling you a little bit about the tax program. And then also we want to leave some time for Q&A, either about the things we've talked about in the lecture, or about the tax program, or, you know, any other questions you have. So let me start first with a bit about the tax program. So we are, I dare say, one of the best tax law programs at LLM level in the world. It's kind of hard to make that, you know, you have to be careful when you make that statement, because tax is very, like all of law is, most of law is very jurisdiction specific. And therefore it can become somewhat difficult to compare programs across jurisdictions. Nonetheless, we have a very strong program. We're one of the larger ones, certainly one of the strongest in the UK and Europe. And that's whether you measure it in terms of the number of students or where our students come from. Typically, we have 20 or 30 jurisdictions that are represented in any given year. And I'll tell you a little bit why that's important. And also in terms of the modules that we offer. We have a very international program. That's true in terms of us, in terms of the academics. It's true in terms of our visiting and guest lecturers, and it's true in terms of the student body, which I hope will include you in the coming year or two. And that gives us, and one of the reasons I think that we're such a strong program is that it gives us a very international, jurisdictional, multi-jurisdictional perspective. We do talk about domestic jurisdictions, and the basis of taxation is always at the national level, but it's increasingly true that you cannot practice, or that more and more practitioners and also revenue officials and also in-house people and so on are dealing with international or cross-border issues. It's just in the nature of the commercial world that we live in. And therefore that is true for tax. And the tax program at CCLS is particularly international, particularly comparative, and particularly cross-border. So we're very much in a position to take advantage of that, if you will. And then the other aspect of that is that, as I said, we typically have 20 or 30 jurisdictions represented, so to speak, among the student body. That means, and we tend to run, as you'll see, or at least I certainly tend to try to run my lectures in a very interactive fashion. And that means you don't just get to hear from me and my exposure to various jurisdictions, but also from your classmates with their knowledge and experience, academic practice, revenue authority, from their own jurisdictions. But also these are, you guys and your colleagues and your ultimately fellow alumni are going to be leading the tax world, or among the leaders, let's say, of the tax world. And that means that you have, or hopefully will have, a network of people, from literally all over. I mean, when I say all over, we get students from the UK, from Africa, mostly sub-Saharan Africa, from the Middle East, from East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, Europe, Latin America, some, not many, admittedly, from North America and from Australia. Almost every continent every year, basically, or every part of every continent every year. And that will be your future network as well. So you learn and you get this exposure while you're at CCLS, and then you have these colleagues and hopefully friends as you go forward in your in your career. And it's very diverse as well in terms of backgrounds. So there will be people who have little or no tax background, either because they were in something else or because they're coming out of basically an LLB program. You'll have people who aren't lawyers at all, but who have a tax background, people from the revenue, from their respective, from a revenue authority, occasionally people from an international organization. And that enriches the discussion. And also it means that we have to, as much as we can, we try very hard to cater to a very wide range of backgrounds in terms of the module choice and so on. I mean, I won't spend a lot of time, more, at least at this point, talking about the program, but we have we also have a very broad range of modules. So we have principles of taxation, which we'll talk about a little bit, or I'll talk about a little bit today. We have international tax. We have US taxation, and we teach Chinese taxation, not as a separate module, but as part of other modules. We have a module on taxation in emerging and developing countries. This coming year, I'm very excited to be offering for the first time a module on tax administration and procedure. It's really a range, a breadth, and I dare say depth of modules that you will not see elsewhere, at least not in the UK and Europe, and not in too many places outside of the UK and Europe either, I dare say. So it's really quite a unique program. Okay, I've pitched the tax program, I think, enough, at least for the moment. Let me move on to a bit of taster lecture. So I'd like to give you a sense of one of our modules. It's called Principles of Taxation. This is from what I usually give as the first lecture. The module is designed we get all sorts of students with backgrounds, but it's more for people who have a bit perhaps less background in taxation. and perhaps want to feel more comfortable or to get a refresher in the sort of the basic groundings of taxation. We go in, let's see if I can get this right, there we go. So basic principles of taxation, jurisdictional bases, and then we probably won't get to income taxation and taxation of capital gains. To understand the topic, right, any topic, including taxation, it's important to know and to occasionally remind oneself of the fundamental principles. What's a tax? Why tax? What do you tax? When do you tax? Who and how, right? The standard W with one H questions, right? So what's a tax? The PowerPoint wasn't working. Normally I would use a PowerPoint and then I could do the reveal, right? The slideshow reveal, but it's not letting me do the slideshow. So I've gone with the PDF version because it amounts to the same thing. So I won't reveal it yet. But what's a tax? Okay, and I would welcome and encourage you to drop things into the chat if you want to. What's a tax? What are we talking about? Anyone want to jump in on that? A penalty for doing something right. Yeah, I can see where that comes from. I mean, certainly one it often feels like you've worked hard, you've made some money, and then the government comes and takes 20 or 30 or more likely 30 or 40% from you. And that can feel extremely unfair, although as was famously said, arguably, and there's some truth to it, taxation is the price we pay for a civilized society, or at least for the public goods that are provided in what we hope is a civilized society. But that is definitely an aspect of taxation, right? And the economists in particular are very conscious of that kind of issue of, not having a drag on the economy, right? Because the more the state takes out, is the less that's available to you and to the sort of the general economy, the private economy more generally. It's the price of public services, absolutely, Isan. So and thank you, Mohammed. So yes, but how would you define it? That's really more, the flip side of that is to some extent, why do we tax and what do we do with the money that we collect in taxation? If I asked you to define a tax or taxation, what is a tax? Anyone want to have a go at that? Every time I give money to the government, is it a tax? Is it always a tax? What do you think? Okay, so Walid says a fee, charge, or levy, basically from a citizen to the state in response to the provision of public infrastructure, public goods, etc. A duty that is compulsory and paid to the government. Okay, says Maureen, also true. But both accurate, but I would add that you would have to include what Mohammed has just put through, which is a general contribution. Usually we think of taxation in terms of a general contribution to government resources or to state resources that is not in response for public services, absolutely right, but that is not in response to a specific provision of services. So if I, let's say it's not true in this country, but let's say we had state provision of electricity or gas or whatever, let's say it's a state-owned company, and I pay the state for the electricity I use, we would not normally think of that as a tax. We would consider it some sort of charge for a particular provision of services. Same for garbage collection if you have a particular payment. Same actually typically for tolls on the roads, passport, right? If there's a fee for taking out a passport, all this kind of thing. So we would normally think of that. So yes, so Mohammed is sort of amplifying exactly. So normally we wouldn't think of that as a tax. It's not a service charge, and it has to be compulsory, right? Which some of you have, several of you have mentioned. If you're just for some reason donating money, you know, or I don't know, buying state bonds or something, which is kind of a way of donating money, that's not a tax. Okay, so very good, right? So, and lo and behold, on the next slide, I have exactly that, right? What is a tax? Compulsory contribution levied by government, right? So sometimes you get this question of, if we don't recognize, especially in the cross-border context, if we don't recognize your government, we may not recognize what you're giving them as a tax, which may then have some ramifications in terms of a tax credit or so on and so forth, right? So that sometimes comes up as well, and not a service charge. Okay, why tax? Again, I'll give it a minute or two. I don't want to reveal the slide yet, right? Normally in class, if you know, when you're in class, you may have these slides in advance. So again, you may see it one way or another. You'll probably have seen it before I've done it in the lecture. But why tax? One thing has already been mentioned by I'd have to go back and check, but Isan has sort of implicitly said as the price of public services. So that's right, to pay for public services. Stuti says major source of revenue for the country to fund common expenditures. Mohammed says all correct. So that's all, you're all right. What else? And historically, that's been the fundamental understanding of why the state, whether it's a monarchy, whether it's an ancient kingdom, whether it's a modern state, why the state collects money is because it needs to do things. That costs money, right? That takes resources. So we collect them from our subjects or our citizens. Obviously, the relationship between the individual and the state has changed. Well, it differs across countries. It's also changed radically over the course of history. So Stuti says to bring balance among all classes of people. Absolutely, we tend to use the term redistribution of wealth, but you're absolutely right. This is a concept that's as old as religious texts, but is probably stronger in the last 100 or 200 years. This notion of redistribution of wealth, some sort of social welfare function of the state, which then requires revenue to fund that redistribution or that provision of services that is keyed to need effectively. So that's absolutely right. Again, something that varies across countries and that has varied historically. I mean, that's tied into the public finance side of taxation, which is to say the other side of taxation, which is where the money goes after those bad guys in the government have collected it from you, right? You know, hopefully it's spent properly, but how it's spent and for what purposes, how efficiently and so on is sort of the other side of taxation, which we don't really talk about too much in a tax LLM, right? That's the public finance side. Chris says implementation of fiscal policy. Yes, you're absolutely right. You'll see it's not on my slide, but you're absolutely right that it's something that is certainly from the fiscal policy point of view seen as a function of taxation. I, as a tax law person, tend to think of that as problematic, right? If you're using fiscal policy, if you're trying to reach certain fiscal policy aims, you have to ask whether taxation is necessarily the best way to go about it. But Chris, you're absolutely right. Maybe that's why I didn't put it on the slide, because I don't think it's a good use of taxation, generally speaking. But you're right that that's one. And there's typically one more that particularly, I would say, in the last 30 or 40 years has come up. And I'll even give you a little hint. It's come to us from those, from the economists primarily. Anyone want to have a quick stab at that? No? Okay, no worries. So the other thing that's come up, that, you know, that's discussed increasingly in the last 20 or 30 years is this question of externalities. To tax, to pay, so not just the provision of public services, it's kind of the flip side of that. It's how to remedy detriments in public services. So the motivation behind a lot of green taxes in particular is, well, if you're going to pollute, a business, let's say, so not only are you not contributing, you're making money off of something that is then, you know, worsening the public welfare in terms of pollution. Or if you choose to smoke, well, we can make, you know, we're not, or in most societies will leave that at least to some extent up to public choice. But if you are then going to cost social welfare or medicine more, the public health service or whatever more, it's only fair that you should contribute to that ultimate cost of cleanup, of healthcare, or whatever it is, right? So it's kind of the flip side of provision of public services to account for the externalities, right? You make money off something that then pollutes, well, we're going to tax you for the pollution effectively, right? So that's that sort of thing. Okay, so why tax? So we've got four. I think maybe, even though I don't like it as basis for taxation, Chris is right. It is sometimes seen as a reason for taxation. I should probably add that to my slide. What's a good tax? Again, I'm not going to give you the reveal slide quite yet. What's a good tax? Other than as little as possible, going back to that original comment about it being a penalty for, you know, for success, right? What's a good tax? What's a bad tax, if you want to look at it that way? What would you consider to be a bad tax? Anyone? Unfair and inequitable, says Mohammed. Okay, I'll buy that. Unfair and inequitable in what sense? Because there are a couple ways that that could be interpreted. I mean, not that any one of them is more or less correct, but just if you can amplify on that a bit, Mohammed. Okay, so while Mohammed is hopefully typing something else in, Stuti says a bad tax is allows the rich to get richer and the poor getting poorer. Okay, so you don't want a tax to be regressive, right? To tax people who are less well off or with less money worse than people with more. And most people would argue that, in fact, a good tax should be progressive, right? So that it should tax people with more, at least somewhat more proportionally, right? And it's easy to say that and to say, okay, this tax is progressive in structure, or let's say it's a flat tax, so in theory it taxes everyone equally, but then you have to actually look at the economic incidence of the tax, right? And if it taxes something that everyone uses, but that some people use more than others, and those people are maybe less well off or whatever, then that's going to be effectively regressive, even if it isn't regressive on paper. So absolutely, so that's a good one. Waleed says, a good tax, one that gives you a benefit, decreases your liabilities. Well, certainly from a taxpayer's point of view, I definitely agree with that. That's not probably a primary structural, you know, consideration when you're trying to create a tax or thinking about a tax. Ihsan says, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Ihsan says, bad tax impoverishes citizens. So first of all, you have this question of regressivity, right? Who's bearing the burden? Who's really paying the majority of the tax? But also implicit, I'm not sure if you were thinking of this exactly, Ihsan, but implicit in that is if it's too high, if it's too much of a penalty for success, that's probably not fair. It's also economically damaging because, and we've seen this historically in jurisdictions where, or to the extent that you have tax rates that are very, very high, people quite logically say, well, if you're going to tax me 70%, I'm not going to bother, right? At a certain point, people say it's not worth it, right? And then that discourages activity, economic activity, work, and so on. That's not a good tax, presumably. Mohammed says two things in his comment, right? Should be easy to implement, okay, which I agree, but it's a different point than what we've been discussing. And distribute wealth. I'm guessing you mean redistribute, right? Redistribute wealth. That goes back into that idea of progressivity. Stuti has another very good point. Cost, but going back to the admin side, the cost of collection should not be more than the tax collected. Not only, you're absolutely right. In fact, I would make it the comment much stronger, Stuti. I would say it has to be much, much less than the cost of collection. On the admin side, we typically think of something under 10% as being an effective, or rather an efficient tax collection, ideally actually even below 5, right? If you're spending 50% of your tax collecting tax, something's wrong, right? That's something we'll talk about in the tax administration and procedure module, right? And it's a problem that many jurisdictions face, particularly developing countries. Well, some developing countries have strong tax systems, but many do not. That's an issue that they often have, right? So that's a very good point, right? Maureen says a good tax is simple, so they can be understood and reduce the cost of compliance. Very good point. And she also says transparent. Absolutely. You want a system that is relatively easy to follow, that is clear, that you don't necessarily need an LLM in tax to be able to understand, at least up to a certain point. All excellent points. Okay, in the interests of time, I will now give you the reveal. I would suggest that these are the primary ones. Many of them we've just talked about, you know, that you guys have just sort of made comments on. Equitable, certain, stable, transparent, right? Administrable and efficient, we've talked about that, right? Not too expensive to comply with, I would say actually from the taxpayer's point of view and from the revenue authority's point of view. Simple, you know, fairly clear, fairly understandable, neutral, right? So people should be treated equally, all other things being equal. Progressivity is to some extent a violation of that, but it's one that most people are happy with, at least up to a point. How progressive then becomes sometimes a question. No one mentioned, but I would say governed by law, right? So whatever the legal system is in your jurisdiction, tax laws should go through that process. They should go through that process to some, you know, fairly high level of detail. You don't want the revenue authority or anyone else just sort of deciding what they're going to tax, because then you get into all sorts of rule of law questions and potential for corruption and so on and so forth. And then the one that's come up in the last 20 or 30 years, the reality is this last one, that's why I put it at the end, is internationally competitive, right? Because just like for practitioners and taxpayers, the cross-border context comes up. It's also true increasingly that governments and revenue authorities have to look at things from a cross-border perspective. The smaller the jurisdiction is, or maybe I should say more to the point, the smaller the economy of the jurisdiction is, the more likely, not necessarily, but the more likely it is to have a large cross-border element. North Korea is an obvious exception, right? But typically that is the case, in which case that international aspect, cross-border aspect, becomes more important. Before we move off this slide, let me ask you a question. What's the problem here? I haven't made it explicit, but what problem might you see in this list, right? And this, you know, we can argue about the terminology. We can argue about overlap between these. We could break it down a bit more. We could lump things together a bit. You know, there's no single, you know, absolutely accurate list. Although I think this one is not too bad. But leaving that kind of issue aside, there's a problem here. What is a good tax? And I've given you what, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 suggestions. You know, there are roughly, you know, 8, 9, 10, 11 categories that we would group this under. What's the problem? Can you get all of these? What do you think, guys? Can you get all these things at the same time? Yes, Maureen, absolutely. Factors differ with regard to developing countries. Absolutely true, says Stuti, also very correct. That's true. This will look different to different jurisdictions, depending on their economic development, depending on their cultural history, their fiscal policies, how much money they need, basic political and policy decisions about how big you want the state to be, and therefore how much money you need the state to have to do what it is. And again, that's something that differs between jurisdictions and has also differed historically, right? So historically, the state was much smaller than most modern states, or at least most strong modern states. All true, right? Absolutely, all correct. The other problem is they're somewhat mutually exclusive, or at least they conflict. If you want it to be certain, I think Maureen said simple, right? If you want it to be, and you're right? But if you want it to be certain, it's going to be detailed. If you want it to be simple, it's going to be general. At some point, you start to have problems with how neutral it is, or at least how neutrally it's applied, how well it's known in advance, right? Because the more detail you put into the law and regulations, the more it's known in advance, but the more complex it becomes, the more work for people like you and me, right? But perhaps the more complicated for the taxpayer and so on. The basic point being that you cannot get all of these. You know, if you're thinking of a set of sliders, of 10 sliders on the screen, if you push one of them all the way to 100%, whatever 100% means in these contexts, something else is going to get pushed back. You're not going to max out on all of these at the same time. It just doesn't work. They are to some extent in competition or in friction, or however you want to put it. Right? So this in itself becomes a balancing act, depending on what you value more, depending on what's more important in society, perhaps on the level of education of your taxpayers. You may want to treat businesses different than individuals, big businesses different than small business, et cetera, right? So it becomes on a fundamental policy level, very interesting if you're into this sort of thing, but very complicated. Potentially very complicated, and very important in terms of its ramifications for what really happens in the system. Okay. Why tax? We've talked about what to tax, right? So what about what to tax? Well, okay, so in the interest of time, we'll be a little bit more, I'll talk a little bit more and have questions a bit less, or discussion a bit less. You know, so you can think of what to tax in terms of the objects of taxation, or you can think of it as, to some extent, the when, right? The life cycle aspects in terms of points of movement or activity at which you can tax. And you can have both of these to some extent going on in your tax system at the same time, right? So you can think about taxing land, of course, is the traditional thing. This is the one that says oldest time, followed closely by goods, right? Because they're tangible and they're easy to tax, particularly land, because it's not going anywhere and you can't hide it, right? And then more recently, income and capital, or stages in the cycle. You can do it at creation. You can do it at some point during holding, or perhaps on an annual basis or whatever. You can do it when you've consumed it. GSTs and VATs are based on the concept of consumption. You can do it at a point of transfer. So a tax at the point of sale, or a tax at the point of death, right? At a transfer at a point of death, or at a point of gifting, right? So you can think of when/what to tax in both of those sort of contexts. Okay, we could go on like this in a way that I hope you would find interesting, You know, we could, I mean, normally this is like a 2-hour lecture, right, with a lot of discussion, with different perspectives from people, you know, coming from a revenue authority, coming from private practice, just having filled in their own tax returns, and also in terms of different jurisdictions, right? So in Nigeria, we do this, in Pakistan, we do this, and this kind of thing. So these discussions in class get very interesting. And I learn from them too, to be quite honest. And we, just so you think, you know, just in case you think we don't get technical, obviously we talk about technical application as well, but we try, I think it's fair to say, across the modules, to also put it in context and to look at different jurisdictions and different approaches. Because there's invariably more than one way to do things, but there's also invariably only there's a limited subset, right? There's X number of ways to do something, and they will work better or less well depending on what your appetite, which is to say the jurisdiction's appetite is for certain things, depending again on certain aspects of the economy, on development, on culture, on fiscal culture, you know, and so on and so forth, right? So over the course of an LLM, or even 1 or 2 modules, if you're not planning to do the LLM in tax, but maybe to take a module or 2, you will get hopefully a good sort of perspective, not only of particular mechanisms and particular way of doing things, but why they're there, and how, you know, why countries choose certain ways of going about it, and how taxpayers react, right? And why taxpayers react in certain ways. So, and on that note, for those of you who are perhaps not planning to do the LLM in tax, but maybe take a module or 2, I would say this. If you're going to be a commercial lawyer, you should know something about tax, because tax permeates almost every aspect, sooner or later, almost every aspect of commercial decision-making, in most jurisdictions at least, and frankly, lots of aspects of personal life, right? You want to set up a business, do I do it as a sole practitioner? Do I incorporate? You know, I want to borrow money, who do I borrow it from? In what jurisdiction? In what form? Do I instead, you know, incorporate and sell the shares, right? All these things get driven in part, sometimes in large part, by tax, right? So if you're a commercial lawyer, you should know something about taxation. And if you're not, you should still know something about taxation, because it just plays such a huge role in our lives, unfortunately, and also in government, right? So if you're an administrative lawyer, if you're interested in public law or public international law, again, taxation is a huge part of that. So I'll stop with my pitch for tax generally. We've got, I guess, about 15 minutes or so. So I'm happy, and I'm sure Charlotte also is happy to talk about any aspect of the program, or the substance, or, you know, CCLS more generally, that you might have. So I'll stop for the moment.
Thank you, Bernard. That was really engaging, and I feel like I've learned something, not from any kind of law background at all. So thank you for that. If you have any questions, please feel free. I've just put a message in the chat to add any questions in that you may have for us, and we'll kind of do our best to answer them.
Okay. I've just opened the Q&A as well.
Perfect. And modules are normally selected in September, aren't they, Bernard? And I know this tax law is available in quite a few programs.
Yes. So as you guys may know, obviously if you do the tax LLM, so most or all of your modules would be in tax. In fact, you have to take at least 120 credits out of your 180 in tax. Actually, most of our tax students take 150 or more. And I think that speaks to the strength of the program and the range of modules that we offer on tax. We are one of the stronger programs in that regard. But if you're not, You can take 30 credits, sorry, up to 60 credits on any program that you want. But also several of the tax modules are actually part of other programs. So you could, because of the nature of those programs, banking and finance, commercial and corporate, and international business law in particular, international business law and commercial and corporate in particular. You could take some of the tax modules and have it actually count to your 120 as well, right? And then go and take certain other modules outside of your program. So we get a lot of tax LM students, but we also get a lot of non-tax students doing tax modules, I think for very good reasons, as I've suggested.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the huge benefits of studying here at CCLS, is that there's such a huge range of modules to choose from, even if you're doing something else, which is great.
I absolutely agree.
And kind of a question that people always are interested in. I imagine you've still got quite some contacts of students that have gone on after they've studied the tax law LLM. Have you got any good connections or anyone that has gone on to do something exciting afterwards in terms of mobility?
I'm not sure exactly how you define exciting, but I mean, our LLMs tend to do very well. They go, just like they come from many backgrounds, they also go off or back too. So we have people who've taken a year off because they want to strengthen their experience, or maybe they've even been sent by their company or their revenue authority or whatever, and then typically will go back where they came from, so to speak, from an employment point of view. You have others who are doing it, as I've suggested, straight off of a first degree. Well, in that case, would be normally in law, from that context, they go to accounting firms, they go to law firms, they go to consulting firms, sometimes in-house. I think that's a little bit more difficult straight out of the LLM if you haven't worked before. You have, so you have all sorts of, avenues. I mean, tax is interesting in that regard. It depends on the jurisdiction, of course, because some people stay in the UK or are from here originally. Some go back home to their home jurisdiction. Some go elsewhere, to sort of a third jurisdiction. But people have a broad range depending on the jurisdiction in terms of employers or types of employers, and also because we have a strong international and comparative focus, I think it's relatively easy for our students to get those kinds of jobs, more so than if you were just doing, let's say, UK domestic law. We do teach UK domestic law. We have some good modules on UK domestic law, and they typically get a good number, they get a good number of students, but it's not the primary focus. We really are an international and comparative program. Maureen, so I hope that answers, sort of addresses that point. Maureen says,
of course, that's great.
Okay, thanks. Okay, so Maureen says, 3 different modes of assessment: essay writing, written exam, and final assessment exercise. Okay, and what's the final assessment exercise? So the final assessment exercise is basically QM jargon for a take-home exam. So because it started largely because of the pandemic to take exams online. Most exams were written in person before then. It looks like that will continue. So some exams, at least some exams, will continue to be online with a fixed amount of time, but you do them at home as opposed to coming in and sitting at a desk and writing. But that's basically what an FAE means. So if you think of it in that sense, most of our modules are assessed either by some sort of an exam, a written exam, or by some sort of essay, sort of more research product type thing. There is also a dissertation, which is elective, but many students, well, it will be elective next year, but many students choose to write a dissertation for 30 credits. And that, of course, is a research project with a written, with a written output, as they like to say. So most of our, the bulk of the assessments, Maureen, are of one of those two broad types. There are modules with some credit assigned, some portion of the final mark assigned to presentations or class participation or something else. But I don't know offhand exactly what the, how many modules have that, but that's a relatively small component. I hope that answers your question fully, Maureen.
Thank you. I'm sure it did. It was a very detailed answer, which is always very helpful for everyone else, I'm sure, as well. We had someone just checked, Antara just messaged to say that obviously she arrived late and asked if a recording will be available, and it will be sent out to everyone so you can access this later as well. If you have any more questions, please feel free to add them in. Bernard, I think you've exhausted everyone with your interaction.
Well, I hope in a good way and not in a bad way.
No, in a very good way. It's nice to see interaction from everyone and getting involved on the session. It's just a shame it can't be longer, as we're obviously accommodating everyone's busy schedules, I'm sure. So
absolutely. Any other questions either about the program generally or about specific modules? I mean, we have modules on, well, this one comes from Principles of Taxation. We have 2 modules on international tax law, by which I mean sort of the comparative and sort of OECD, UN, right, tax treaties, that sort of thing. We have modules on, I've seen your question, give me 1 second, Maureen. We have modules on specific jurisdictions, the US international taxation in particular, tax administration and procedure, transfer pricing, sort of taxation and the digital economy. So we have sort of subject-specific, jurisdiction-specific, more comparative, so we have a range, I think quite a nice range of modules and of types of modules. So I'm happy to sort of address any of those. In terms of which modules do I teach, Maureen? So I convene and teach part of this Principles of Taxation that I just gave you a sort of 15-20 minute taster on, or maybe it was a bit more. I teach US international taxation because I was in practice in New York for some time before coming to the UK and becoming an academic. I teach tax system design and policy in emerging and developing economies because I'm very interested in the rest of the world when we get outside of the OECD, what I call the usual suspects, the usual 40, 50 jurisdictions. And I will be teaching this new module on tax administration and procedure. And that gives you some idea of particular areas of interest of mine. I also give lectures on Chinese taxation, which is an area in which I have some interest and hopefully knowledge. And depending on the year, I give some lectures on international taxation, which is led by someone else, but is to some extent co-taught. Well, so that varies a little bit from year to year. So I hope that answers that question. Any other sort of thoughts or questions about the program or specific aspects of it?
We have a question in the chat just about any kind of recommended reading at all.
Yes. So it's a very good question, Walid, and also a difficult one to answer for a few reasons. Well, when you say commercial corporate, you mean for the commercial and corporate for that LLM? Is that what you mean, Walid? Or for commercial taxation? Corporate, right? Okay, so that one is, I mean, I only look at sort of the tax side of that, so I'm possibly not the best person to answer that question. The thing about but I will say something that I think is relevant to your question and is also true for tax, because often I get this kind of question with reference to tax as well, which is there is no end to the amount of material that's available on commercial taxation, on corporate taxation, on any aspect of tax, or for that matter, commercial law. There's so many sort of areas of commercial law or tax law, each of which have, or most of which, let's say, have extensive literatures of different kinds, which is to say more academic ones, less academic ones, more practitioner orientated, more academically orientated ones, and so on. And also some are more comparative or international, some are more jurisdiction specific. So if you were asking me this question about taxation, and I suspect any of my colleagues in commercial and corporate would have a similar reaction, their first question would be to answer your question with another question, which I know is sometimes annoying, which is, can you narrow that down a bit for me, please, right? When you say tax, let's say, or commercial law, what aspect of commercial law and where in the Middle East and North Africa, for example, or in developing countries, or what, right? Because otherwise I can give you a reading list as long as your arm, they give you a 30, 40, 50 page reading list, but I'm not sure it would be terribly helpful. So that's, it's a very reasonable, very good, very legitimate question, but it's hard to answer, particularly at that sort of level of that macro level. So I hope that kind of answers your question, and anyone else, right? And I see that, and thank you, Charlotte, for putting for popping a link to my profile into the chat. I'm happy to, and on the profile page, you'll see my email, which is also here on the first slide of the presentation, and I'm more than happy to entertain any sorts of questions, which hopefully I can answer, and if not, I can sort of forward on to the right person. So do feel free to email me with any questions you have. Your opportunity to ask questions does not run out in 2 or 3 minutes when Charlotte closes the session. Jihan, I hope I have pronounced that correctly, asks, how many lesson days are there per week? So there is teaching from Monday to Friday, less on Friday because both the students and the academics tend to prefer having Friday off. But there are lectures between, you could potentially be going to class any day of the 5-day work week. If you're in we haven't absolutely finalized the timetable for next year, and it does depend to some extent on the module, but I think in most cases, if you're in a 30 credit module, you will be meeting, you'll be meeting for 3 hours a week with a break. In most modules, I think that will mean a 3-hour block with a break, not 2 1.5-hour blocks, if you see what I mean. And then that runs 10 weeks plus a study week over the course of the 11-week term. If it's a 15 credit module, it would be 1.5 hours once a week for again, times 10. So I'm not sure if that's exactly what you were asking, if that was part of what you were asking, but I answered it anyhow, so there you go. Or I addressed that as well. So I hope that answers your question, Jihan. Any other questions about anything, actually?
I think we're very close to being out of time anyway. So I'm very grateful for your offer for people to get in touch with you, Bernard. That's brilliant. I think it's probably worth adding just from that question about kind of lesson days is where we kind of say that you expect to be have kind of 40 hours a week with study time filled when you're with us, when you're doing your LLM, as it's quite intensive. So I know a lot of people ask about kind of days based on whether they can work part-time as well, which a lot of our students do, but it's just allowing that time as well to make sure you get the study time in for your own reading as well.
Yeah, no, Charlotte is absolutely right. And actually, if I can just tack on to that, just to be clear, I know, and again, we have students from literally all over. I said 20 to 30 in a given year, but actually over the course of, the years I've been here, which is a while, we've seen about 60 jurisdictions on the tax program, maybe a bit more. So we've really seen a lot of different sort of backgrounds, so to speak. And the reason I'm saying this is because I know you come from different educational backgrounds as well, different expectations. And that's true in terms of assessment, something that, Maureen has sort of talked about, at least about asking about assessment. It's also true in terms of the lecture home prep balance, so to speak. So in some countries, I know, without naming names, that the expectation is that you will sit in the lecture, in a lot of lectures, and then not do perhaps that much outside the lecture. The Anglo-North American module, if you will, is that you have less time in lectures, but the expectation is that you will do more prep outside the class, which is what Charlotte was quite correctly getting at. Both in terms of preparing for the lectures, reviewing after the lecture, and then to the extent you need to prepare for assessments, especially if they're sort of the more research essay or dissertation type assessments. So that's something to keep in mind. You may only be in class, so to speak, for 10 or 15 hours a week, but the expectation is that, particularly if you're planning to do well, and generally our students do plan to do well and do pretty well, that you would be spending some multiple of that outside the classroom. How you structure that, you have obviously some freedom, but this is not a program where you come in at 9, you take notes till 2 and you go home, with that kind of that kind of thing. And one of the things, actually, just on that note, I know I'm running over, Charlotte, but I'll just say, certainly I think in tax and I think in CCLS, generally, we tend to be pretty interactive. So and most of the modules are relatively small, certainly not the sort of 200 people in a lecture hall that you may have experienced as undergraduate students. So you get that kind of interaction, generally speaking, with the lecturers, with the academics as well, which again, I think is one of the strengths of CCLS and of the tax program in particular. So.
Fantastic. It's all good information, so don't worry, Bernard. So, right, I think we'll wrap it up there. So thank you to everyone that's joined. I will send the recording for the session round. So if you want to catch up at all, please feel free to look at that. You've obviously got Bernard's details here, and hopefully you'll have noted that down. And if you ever have any questions, please do get in touch with the team. We're always happy to help. There are further taster lectures happening over the course of the month, so please keep an eye out on your inboxes, and I'm sure there'll be more here. But thank you very much, Bernard, for the lecture today. It was very useful, and I'm sure really helpful for everyone here.
Not at all. Thank you, Charlotte, and thanks to everyone who came and attended, came virtually. And again, please feel free to be in touch if you have any other questions.
Lovely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Have a lovely rest of your day.
Bye-bye now.